Nothing can justify Israel's response to October 7. Responding with a genocide will only result on a failure of any agreement now.
Where's your political imagination and vision? A vision that says, here's how we can live with Palestinians, not replacing Palestinians. Here is how we can live more safely.
It's difficult to say whether it's too soon or too late to be contemplating a political solution in Gaza. In September alone, Israel expanded its attacks from Gaza to Lebanon, hitting the heart of Beirut for the first time in recent history, striking Yemen and Syria too. A year after Israel's war began in Gaza, where are we now? Gaza is in complete ruin and is still under daily bombardment, with deaths reported there every single day. Hamas's future, or even its present, is uncertain. Israel is facing internal and external condemnations that seem to make no difference whatsoever to its military plans. And with the war spilling over, Palestinians in Gaza continue to bear the biggest brunt of Israel's wrath. And even though it seems like the situation now is beyond containment, any talks of a long-term peace need to begin with a ceasefire.
Glimmer of hope in the war between Israel and Hamas.
Israel and Hamas appear to be inching closer to a possible ceasefire deal.
Ceasefire deal in Gaza.
2 days of talks on a ceasefire and hostage release.
The US-backed proposal could see the release of the remaining hostages in Gaza.
In the first few months since October 7 last year, news of ceasefire agreements brought some hope to Gazans who thought this would only be a short-term situation, that they would soon be able to try and rebuild what they lost and attempt to pick up where they left off, albeit with some loss. But any hope and any progress in talks was always short-lived. Every time, discussions would falter as quickly as they had started. The terms for each successive agreement became increasingly impossible. The word ceasefire kind of lost its meaning. And a year later, it's not even something that people realistically believe will happen. Bombs continue to fall with catastrophic loss in Gaza. Families are still being displaced, children are still starving, and aid continues to be stopped at Gaza's borders. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This is the third and final episode of our limited series covering the past year in Gaza. In the first 2 episodes, we looked at Gaza before the war, what happened on October 7, and the humanitarian catastrophe that followed. In this episode, we'll look at the fading attempts to end the war there. We also open old wounds to understand why, decades later, all efforts for a political solution for Palestine have failed, and ask the difficult question, what future prospects for peace can there be? Our episode features voices and views from the Palestinian ambassador in the UK, Hassan Nasrallah, and political experts from the US, the UK, and Israel. Israel's military declined our request for an interview after initially accepting, and the Foreign Ministry said it will not be able to participate in this series. Nothing about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or peace process has ever been easy. But how did a ceasefire go from being a prospect to such an impossible feat?
You had the Shalit, who was kidnapped by the Hamas in the past, and it was a very successful operation also, and many Palestinians were released. And Hamas' mindset was to repeat the same.
This is Taghreed Al-Khudari, who we heard from in episode 1 of this series. She's a Palestinian analyst who used to live in Gaza.
They thought with capturing that number of soldiers, they will do the same, that there will be negotiation and immediately it will go. They expected, of course, Israel retaliation, militarily speaking, but they didn't expect a genocide. They didn't expect that level of response and no accountability.
So first we have to understand Israelis and Palestinians are in a permanent state of war.
Daniel Levy is the president of the US Middle East Project. He is also a former Israeli peace negotiator and advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office.
What we are talking about in the post-October 7th context is a cessation of these particular hostilities. And of course, we have been there before. There have been exchanges of fire between a Hamas-led Gaza and Israel, some particularly nasty, vicious, destructive, especially for Palestinians, rounds of fighting in 08, 09, in 2014, 2021, all of those rather quickly actually came to a cessation without the broader envelope of war changing. Obviously, what we have seen in this past year is well in excess of anything that we have seen previously.
The warring parties have been negotiating through mediators, mainly the US, Egypt, and Qatar. There have been some concessions along the way, but both Hamas and Israel have stuck to their guns on several demands. Hamas on the complete withdrawal of troops from Gaza, for displaced families to return to their homes, and the release of Palestinian detainees from Israeli prisons. Israel on the release of the hostages and a continuation of the war until Hamas is eliminated in Gaza, and a refusal to withdraw from what it deems are strategic positions in Gaza that also transgress on Egyptian sovereignty.
I think it's been quite clear for many months that there is a formula to which Hamas can agree, which brings this round of fighting to a close. However, the Israeli position throughout this has been there can be a pause in this military operation in Gaza, but there cannot be a cessation. But Netanyahu has insisted Israel will continue with its military operation, and that's the big gap. So that's where the disconnect lies. The Israeli intention here seems to be that not only is it politically important for Netanyahu with regard to his domestic coalition to maintain a state of war, to cast himself in the role of the indispensable wartime leader. To be that, you need wartime. But also this is ideological. So one should not make light of an intention here to finish the job of displacing and ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, of settling their land and denying them rights in perpetuity.
The last time there was any talk of a ceasefire was in August. At the time, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had accepted the deal and that the onus was on Hamas to accept it. But Hamas rejected it, saying it had already accepted the initial version of that deal that the US itself proposed months ago, and that the new version suddenly included new conditions by Israel.
I should just say, Hamas is sort of accepted, but not completely, and Israel pretended to accept, but they didn't accept it at all. And this was supposedly an Israeli proposal, but as soon as Biden said what it was, the Israelis said, oh, no. So nobody's really been playing straight.
That's Hussein Ibish. He's a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a columnist for The National.
I do think it has become clear that Netanyahu is the stumbling block at this point. I mean, Hamas does seem to be interested in a pause and does seem to have acceded to most of the original demands. But as you say, the goal line moved.
One of the most crucial conditions added by Israel in the last proposal was to maintain a military presence in the Salah ad-Din corridor, a strip of land between Rafah in the south of Gaza and Egypt. Israel sent troops to this area in May, violating a 1979 treaty with Egypt. Their presence in this territory, in addition to a corridor that they created to divide the north and south of Gaza, have been strongly rejected by Hamas and Egypt.
Now, this is not lost on Western leaders. The fact that Israel has overreacted dreadfully, whatever they thought about October 7th, whatever they thought about the war initially, that Israel has gone too far is obviously the conclusion of most Western leaders, but they don't quite know how to pull it back.
America's role in the war has been the subject of much controversy. The US has always been Israel's strongest ally, using its veto power at the UN many times to block a ceasefire resolution, and has even been accused of giving Israel diplomatic cover for some of its misconduct. But with an upcoming US election in November, Hussein says that this war has reshaped US rhetoric and support for Israel.
The Democrats and I would say traditional Republicans fall into, especially Democrats though, fall in the United States, fall into three broad generational categories. The older generation, the sort of over 65s, the septuagenarians and octogenarians like Biden and Pelosi and Schumer and all these people who are 80 or what have you, or 70, grew up with the idea of Israel, the liberal experiment, with their mother's milk. They got the undiluted propaganda about 1948, and they swallowed it. And so when you look at someone like Biden, he's viscerally pro-Israel. He's emotionally attached to Israel. And you look at the more middle-aged people like Blinken, they are not as emotionally attached to Israel. They are more distant, but they have completely accepted the narrative that Israel and the special relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv is a huge strategic advantage for the United States. And then when you look at people who are sort of 35 or maybe even 40 and younger, you see a very different attitude. You've seen people of that age cohort resigning from State Department positions, resigning from non-uniform military positions, from intelligence positions over this. And certainly when you get closer to the young professoriate, and above all, of course, the students, there you see not just skepticism of Israel, but a real opposition, principled opposition to the occupation, and a willingness to put the bilateral relationship between the US and Israel at stake.
So if the rhetoric is starting to change in the US, then why hasn't there been more pressure on Israel to end its war? Here's Daniel Levy again.
Words are very cheap. Words are inconsistent and words are meaningless. You can't condemn something and continue to arm it. So to the extent to which US administrations, the Biden administration, has found any language of condemnation, they will off the record say things, but in public they stand foursquare behind Israel. And probably the key missing ingredient has been that the US has consistently armed Israel, which enables it to continue with the war, run diplomatic cover for Israel, which enables it to continue the war, and lied to their own public in America, to the Israelis, and to the world about what's going on. And they've been caught lying.
The US had already signed an historic 10-year deal with Israel in 2016 to provide $38 billion in military aid. A month after October 7, the US approved an additional $14 billion to Israel, mostly for warfare. This happened on the backdrop of many international legal disputes Israel is facing, after the International Court of Justice determined it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide, and the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. It has become hard to see how the war in Gaza and now in Lebanon will end. But Western politicians like US Vice President Kamala Harris have already been discussing the, quote, day after, about who will rule Gaza after the war ends. We'll get into the issue of how Gaza will be governed after the war. But first, we'll look at the political rifts that have been within the Palestinian government for at least 17 years. For that, I spoke to Ambassador Hussam Zomlot, head of the Palestinian mission to the United Kingdom. There have been political divisions in Palestine that didn't help create the right living conditions. What is your response to criticism towards the Palestinian government for these shortcomings?
Well, the Palestinian division over a long period of time, 17 years or so now, has been one of the bleakest chapters of our history, and it has got to end. The unity of the Palestinian people is there, and I must tell you, the Palestinian people are united, and the Palestinian people have a legitimate political system, and that legitimate political system represents every Palestinian, inside or outside. That is the PLO. The PLO is recognized internationally as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So both the political system and the people are united and legitimate. The issue is between factions, political factions. And that issue has got to be resolved in accordance with the expectation of our people, not the international community, not external actors. Our people want political factions to unite and to resolve issues so we are more immune against the root cause. There have been many attempts at resolving the issue between factions, and it seems that of late there has been renewed efforts in China and now a new efforts at this, particularly to come up with a one united plan for what are we going to do with this catastrophe that has befallen our people in Gaza.
People in power in Palestine, the people that make decisions, what is their role in bringing a ceasefire in Gaza, and why do they seem to have been sidelined from every discussion regarding Gaza? It seems like all the regional actors are involved except the Palestinians.
That's not true. That's not accurate. As we speak now, the Palestinian leadership is in New York, and I'm seeing how many meetings they have done. They must have met every single leader in the world discussing these very issues. I mean, and I took part in arranging the meeting with the British Prime Minister and officials here and many others. So, no, there is a lot of efforts. But the particularity of what happened since October has led that one group of the Palestinian people has most of the cards in terms of negotiations. And we have mediators, that includes Egypt and Qatar, who have been mediating this, but with full coordination and cooperation with us. And our position officially has been absolutely bluntly clear. From day one, we needed to reach an immediate and permanent ceasefire. But also, the state of Palestine immediately went for the accountability at the ICC and ICJ. And you hear Netanyahu day in and day out saying that the Palestinian government and the Palestinian leadership is engaged in lawfare against Israel. Well, we are engaged in accountability against the war criminals. And that's why we sought issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, which it's in the process now. And we went to the International Court of Justice to get the advisory opinion you heard about 2 months ago. And then we went to the UN to make sure that is legislated in law. So the state of Palestine is engaged in where it should be engaged, which is international diplomacy and international legality to put pressure on the occupier to end its occupation and to make sure that not only justice is served to the victims of Israel through the ICC and other mechanisms, but also we deter the next war criminals and the next genociders.
What role will Hamas play in the future of Palestine, in the future of Gaza, in the future of a Palestinian government?
Well, Hamas is a political faction in Palestine, and it's not the only one. There are many others. The PLO has its charter, has its commitments. The PLO has its international relations. The PLO sits in every major capital in the world, if not all of them, and sits in the UN and represents the Palestinian people everywhere. And remember, when Hamas decided to run the elections in 2006, the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian national institutions allowed that to happen. So Hamas could be part of our political system based on the dialogue that is happening now. But there are requirements for anybody to be part of any institution. There are certain requirements, and I believe that is exactly what was happening in Peking and Beijing and what is happening now in Cairo and elsewhere to make sure that we are on the same page. Otherwise, just becoming part of something without being exactly on the same page would be problematic.
There have been many attempts throughout the years to reach an effective reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. Most recently, a unity deal in July of this year in China. But is it too late? Taghreed al-Khudari explains.
Now they are working on all of a sudden. It took a genocide in Gaza that Fatah all of a sudden now is back to organizing its house, and it's happening. So this is, I hope it's promising for Fatah. But it took them very long time. The failure also of the Palestinian leadership not to engage all groups together and to agree on a unified vision on resolving this issue of Palestine-Israel has contributed also. So Israel has played a role in strengthening Hamas, but at the same time, the failure of the Palestinian Authority of engaging all, of coming out with a unified PLO, in which they could have really agreed on a unified vision when it comes to resistance, when it comes to the vision of a Palestinian state. This could have saved a lot of time, and this could have saved both, I would say, Israelis and Palestinians.
Israel and the West have been adamant that Hamas cannot govern after the war is over, should that day ever come. Kobe Michael, who you've already heard from earlier in this series, is a senior researcher at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies and Misgav Institute. He says Israel's immediate objectives are to release the hostages and dismantle Hamas's military capabilities. But it also has another long-term mission there.
The third objective of the war is to assure that the Gaza Strip will never become again a sort of a threat like October 7th, and to change the reality on the ground and to replace Hamas with another civilian governance, be it local governance, Palestinian Authority governance, a sort of a regional task force, international task force, or any combination of all of these options. Israel doesn't care about it, but Israel cares that Hamas will not be an alternative anymore, and Hamas will not be able to rule the Gaza Strip.
Many analysts, both inside and outside Israel, have argued that getting rid of Hamas as a group and the concept behind it is impossible. But Kobi believes Israel is getting nearer to its goal.
We did a huge progress in this regard. We are much closer to the end of the war in the Gaza Strip than to the beginning of the war. It doesn't mean that we will not have to continue fighting terrorism in the Gaza Strip as well as we continue fighting terrorism, unfortunately, in the West Bank. But it will be the idea of mowing the grass. It will not be the idea of tackling an organized terror military as we met, unfortunately, on October 7th.
Kobi paints a picture of a Hamas-free Gaza, yet indicates that Israel will continue to conduct military operations there. Hamas was created in 1987, while Israel's illegal military occupation of Palestine started in 1967, 20 years earlier. If history is to repeat itself, then what would a cycle of periodic attacks in Gaza mean for the next 20 years? Here's Hussein Ibish again.
As long as there's an occupation, there's going to be resistance of various kinds. And when you've got young men and people are going to find guns, there will be at least some amount of violent resistance, unless there's a horizon, a real horizon for a political settlement. Now, Israel's own defense minister is now one of the loudest voices, and he is very hawkish, very extreme guy, Yoav Gallant. He's now the one who's saying most loudly, Hamas can't be destroyed, don't be silly. Because Netanyahu keeps saying we're going to destroy Hamas. And this is all in public, and he keeps saying it can't be done. There is no such beast. But obviously this was a ridiculous idea.
Still, Israel has managed to kill key figures in the Hamas movement, as well as Hezbollah, now that it has intensified its war in Lebanon. These assassinations have dealt a huge blow to the so-called axis of resistance, mostly propped up by Iran, making the question of their future a huge question mark. But Hussein has a different take.
Hamas is not a list of individuals and a bunch of equipment that can be destroyed or killed. It's an idea. It's a party. It's a brand. It's a concept. And you can kill Aruri in Beirut, and you can kill Haniya in Tehran, but you haven't eliminated their leadership, and you certainly haven't eliminated Hamas. So what is the purpose of this war? What is the political purpose? And I've maintained from the beginning that Israel doesn't have a political purpose. On October 7, Netanyahu went on Israeli TV and promised a mighty vengeance. Now, that's a direct quote. We will extract a mighty vengeance. And that has been done. Right? The vengeance stuff is done. All right, there's nothing more to take vengeance on. And yet, they're hanging around, and the war has become an insurgency versus a counterinsurgency. And there is no political horizon precisely because Netanyahu will not discuss it. When it's brought up, he says it's too soon to discuss it.
Too soon for Israel, but not soon enough for Palestine. In fact, about 30 years too late. In 1993, the Oslo Accords signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization were supposed to resolve the conflict based on a framework for a two-state solution. Daniel Levy was there at the time and says initially the intentions seemed promising.
And the notion was that if you had a kind of moderate Israeli government that could see an Israeli interest in separating from, delinking from those Palestinian territories occupied in 1967 and a PLO leadership ready to accept and recognize Israel on those 67 lines, and an external facilitator keen to get this over the finishing line, then this was achievable.
Needless to say, that didn't happen at all. Daniel says, in hindsight, Oslo was missing crucial guarantees, mostly because of the implicit rather than the explicit nature of the agreements. There's also much criticism today towards the concessions that the PLO made in Oslo. And over the past 3 decades, What was supposed to be a framework for peace became quite the opposite.
Let's be very clear. The peace process had become a vehicle for Israel's entrenchment of its matrix of control over the Palestinians, a vehicle for creating an ever more deep architecture of apartheid long before October 7th, 2023. So you didn't get the external sponsor and the country on whom Israel is greatly dependent. Then what was missing there is an explicit Israeli commitment, the United States insisting on that, holding Israel accountable when it not only violated that in its negotiation terms of reference, but when it also violated the possibility of that ever happening through its illegal actions on the ground. Most egregiously, the settlements, but not only those. So Oslo had a 5-year time frame to it. That time frame expired a quarter of a century ago, but what this becomes is a vehicle for managing and controlling the Palestinians, the occupation, the advancement of Israeli settlement.
But Oslo was missing something else too, Daniel says.
But the other question mark that, especially with the benefit of hindsight, has to hover over all of this is, was the premise a faulty premise? Was the premise that essentially one could address the occupation that began in 1967 without addressing the foundational question of displacement, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the Nakba, the questions of 1948, the question of does Zionism, as the realization of an ethno-national state, offer a way to coexist, offer a way to have peace? And partition, endorsed by the United Nations in 1947, becomes really a driver of expansionism for Israel. So that foundational question was ignored by Oslo. I very much doubt it can be ignored going forward.
So if not Oslo, then what? I asked Ambassador Hussam Zomlot. Is the two-state solution actually going to happen? Is it a realistic model that we will see in our lifetime? Or is it just a ray of hope that's being waved for Palestinians living under occupation that one day maybe they will live in peace and security?
Well, I think the term two-state solution is also problematic and vague and doesn't really represent the reality. The reality is not that there are two states that are missing and we need to create them. There is one state that is Israel, recognized by the world, has a seat in the UN, and that state is occupying the other state. The solution, and what we need to talk about, is what the ICJ came up with. The solution is ending occupation, dismantling colonialism, resulting in a state of Palestine, sovereign, with Jerusalem as its capital, and the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. There is no other way to peace other than the Palestinian people realizing their sacred, non-negotiable right to self-determination. There is no other model. And this does not require negotiations. This does not require peace processes. This does not require extensive diplomacy. This requires legality. And that's why we are focused in the legal arena, focused in the ICJ, focused at the General Assembly and all the human rights councils and what have you, to make sure that we base our struggle on legal grounds, not just political grounds.
But Israel is not listening to its closest ally on just stopping the bombardment and the killing of children in Gaza. Why would it listen to the ICJ or anyone else about leaving the West Bank?
So it's not an easy process. It's not going to be done tomorrow, but we are on our way. You know the saying, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm on my way. We are on our way. It's been long. It's been difficult. It's been painful. It's been hurtful. We have lost a lot of dear and loved ones, and we continue to do so. But this is a journey that we have to go through as a nation to liberate our land. And I'm not telling you Israel will heed tomorrow, but we need to keep building that pressure. And I tell you, Israel has been unmasked. Israel is a pariah in the international system now. It's a pariah state. So yes, we need to keep going and keep building, and not draw our entire national platform and program and our rights based on what Israel wants. No, it has to be exactly the opposite. It has to be based on what Israel doesn't want. And it doesn't want to end its occupation. We should feel the sadness, but we should be very hopeful. Very hopeful. Hope is very important. Very hopeful, because people like us who have the right, every right, who have the law with us, who live in their land naturally for a long time. We know our land better than anyone else. And who have this support by the world is a people that should be way more hopeful than their oppressors.
Hope is all that remains after a year of war. Hours after Israel announced its invasion of Lebanon, former UN humanitarian aid chief Martin Griffiths said that it's Israel's impunity and lack of accountability by the international community that has emboldened it to expand its attacks beyond Gaza, and to continue carrying out these attacks despite provisional measures adopted by the International Court of Justice earlier this year. The Gaza that was before October 7 is no longer there. Repressive practices in the West Bank have only intensified, making its deadliest year even deadlier, and the violence has officially escalated. All that was unthinkable a year ago has now become normalized. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has been assassinated in Beirut. The fragile threads that connect the Middle East are fraying, and there's a real sense that the entire political landscape that once preserved some semblance of stability in the region could turn upside down. At this junction where we stand today, we're left with a very conflicting question. Do we even want to go back to life before October 7? Or do we want a future where October 7 will never happen again? It seems like an obvious question at first. But what if we ask a mother whose children were killed in an airstrike right before her eyes? Or a father who has had to collect the pieces of his child in a bag? What will they say about the sacrifices they were forced to make? But if you ask this question to the Gazans who have lived through 5 Israeli wars in 17 years, what use is it going back to the same status quo that led to their lives being in ruin and killed the people they love the most? It's a deeply moral question with no good answer. 1 year of war and we still have no good answers. This was the last episode of our limited series covering the war in Gaza. If you missed the first 2, make sure to go back and listen if you want to hear about those first few hours of October 7, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and what life is like for a family struggling for survival there. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and Da'a Farid, who is also our editor. We're audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.